Okay, so Johnny Depp has been suing his ex-wife Amber Heard since 2019, and trial is set to begin on April 11th of this year. And on this channel, we will be live streaming every single day of trial while it's ongoing because they are allowing cameras in the courtroom. So in preparation for that, I wanted to make a video that's a little bit of a primer on the issues in this case. So if you sorta know a few details here and there about Johnny Depp and Amber Heard and their tumultuous marriage, but you don't really know what this whole lawsuit is about, and you don't even know if you should care in the first place, this video is exactly for you. Be sure to watch to the end so you can get a full primer on what this case is all about and why you might want to care about it. Welcome to Legalbytes. If you are new here, my name is Alita. I'm a lawyer licensed in California and DC, and on this channel, we explain the law one bite at a time. So if you're like me, over the last few years, you may have heard some tidbits here and there about the tumultuous relationship that was shared by Johnny Depp and Amber Heard, and which ended in divorce back in 2016. You may have heard that she accused him of beating her up during their marriage, and you may have even seen some of the photos that have been shared around the internet where she shows her face bruised and bloodied up in various ways. You may have even heard about another lawsuit in the UK that's kind of between them, kind of not, but it's also between Johnny Depp and the Sun. And you may have even heard about Johnny Depp's allegations that Amber Heard is the one who's been abusing Johnny Depp all this time, and maybe even something about a severed finger. Maybe you've even heard some audio of Amber and Johnny talking to each other where she admitted to essentially beating on him. And to top things off, you may have even heard some kind of a rumor about a prank about poop in bed. We're not going to get into that one, but somehow it's related to all of this. So before we get too caught up in all of these different stories and vignettes that are swirling around, let's get back to the basics of where this all started and what this lawsuit is all about. So in this video, we're going to go over a bit of how things turned into a lawsuit. Then we're going to get into the allegations of the lawsuit itself, and we're going to get into why people even care about this case in the first place. People are very divided about this, it seems, and very passionate about their positions. So why care in the first place? On that last point, I will say for now that it basically has to do with either domestic violence and people's passions related to victims being able to speak out, as well as the rights of people that have been accused, that may have been wrongfully accused, and at the same time, the concern over the power of social movements on social media and the possibility of somebody having their life ruined overnight just by people reaching a certain conclusion very, very quickly in the process of getting swept up in those movements. Basically, on either side, you have people that are concerned about domestic violence issues and the victims being able to speak out and seek justice. Then you have the people that are concerned about the possibility of somebody taking a social movement that exists to legitimately right wrongs that are existent in our society and taking that movement and hijacking it and exploiting it for their own personal gain and to the detriment or victimization maybe of other people. The people that can be harmed by that are not only the individuals that are accused of certain things that they may or may not have done, but also the real and legitimate victims of these kinds of issues. The more certain stories get amplified that end up turning out to not be true, the less that people are going to believe the real victims that are actually speaking out related to these kinds of movements. For me personally, all of these issues are what attracted me to this particular litigation. And so keep those points in your head as we move forward through some of the details of this case. Okay, so where does this whole story begin? Well, apparently Johnny Depp and Amber Heard met on the set of The Rum Diaries. They apparently dated for several years and then got married in 2015. And according to all kinds of accounts, that relationship was tumultuous from the beginning to the end, and then actually even past the end of it up to today. Now, in this particular video, I'm not going to get into all of the individual incidents that have been alleged between the two in this case, because that can take up a very long video all on its own and realistically is going to take up most of the trial itself. My goal in this video is to give a bird's eye view of this case so that you can understand where to place these different data points in the overall picture. So in 2016, it became clear to both of them that the marriage was no longer working and was probably going to be ending fairly soon. Now, it seems that both sides are indicating that they had wanted the divorce first, but just for purposes of objectivity, it is undisputed that Amber Heard was the one who filed for divorce in May 2016. Now, whether Amber filed for divorce legitimately because she had had enough of the marriage, or whether she filed for divorce more in a strategic move because she knew that otherwise Johnny Depp would be filing for divorce and wanted to get the jump on him, is a conversation for another video. More importantly, at the same time that she filed for divorce, she also filed for a domestic violence restraining order. And on May 27, 2016, she showed up to court with what looked like bruises on her face, with an allegation that just 5 days before, Johnny had gotten into an altercation with her and ended up throwing his cell phone at her face. The public, of course, was alerted to this, and there was a lot of media attention on their divorce. Eventually, they settled the divorce matter, and Amber agreed to withdraw her domestic violence restraining order, and Johnny agreed to give her $7 million. Now, you may have heard that she publicly pledged to donate half of the $7 million to the ACLU and the other half to the Children's Hospital of Los Angeles. But according to information that has come out in the process of this litigation, it sounds like she hasn't donated much of anything to either one. Or maybe she's donated some smaller portions of it, but she definitely has not donated a full $7 million. Now, Amber apparently has her justifications as to why she hasn't donated this full amount, saying that she fully intends to at some point. But at the same time, there are rightfully questions about this hesitancy to donate it. And this is especially because that pledge was related so closely with her allegations of domestic violence. Okay, so that's the divorce matter from a bird's eye view. What is this litigation about? Let me start with a little bit of context and a reminder of what it was like in 2018. I know the last couple years have basically lasted decades, but in 2018, you might remember that we were in the height of the MeToo movement. Around this time, women were taking to Twitter using the hashtag MeToo to talk about issues where they've been sexually harassed or even abused, mostly by other men. And all around the world, women were starting to come out and speak out about instances of their harassment or abuse by men, particularly very powerful men. There were a few instances even of men speaking out about being abused by other men. Kevin Spacey was one of those people that was alleged to have abused another man earlier on in his life. But most notable was the all-powerful Harvey Weinstein, who previously had the ability to make or break careers in Hollywood. He ended up being criminally charged, then convicted, and then charged again in another jurisdiction for these kinds of allegations. And what came out was pretty terrible. We can basically all agree that Harvey Weinstein legitimately was a monster and did terrible things to terrorize women and basically hold kind of an entire industry hostage for his own selfish purposes. So things that were coming out had a lot of hidden truth. And along with that came a common refrain: believe her or believe all women. And to a lot of people, at a time when things were coming out that had previously been kept secret by wealth, power, and influence, this kind of made sense to them. So now hold on to that context, because we're about to get into the heart of this specific matter. In December 2018, Amber Heard published an op-ed in the Washington Post. In it, she talked about having spoken out about domestic violence and suffering the wrath of society as a result. Now, in the article, she doesn't explicitly name Johnny Depp, but based on the things that she wrote and based on the context that everyone pretty much knows about the very public divorce that they went through, everyone can basically reasonably conclude that what she's talking about is her relationship with Johnny Depp. Now, the immediate result of this article getting published was that Johnny Depp got canceled, like a lot of men did very, very quickly at this time. Even though he basically invented the role of Captain Jack Sparrow, Disney dropped him from the subsequent Pirates of the Caribbean movie, which was like number 5 or 6 or 7 at this point. I mean, he basically was the reason why people were still watching Pirates of the Caribbean, if they were still watching it at this point, and they decided to drop him. That's how much power these allegations had at this time. So a few months later, in March 2019, Johnny Depp sued Amber Heard for defamation. I'll get into the specific elements that need to be proved for defamation, but if you're unfamiliar with the term, just know that it's basically where the defendant has lied about the plaintiff, and they've lied in such a way that they've caused massive reputational harm. Now, in this particular case, Johnny Depp was suing Amber Heard for defamation for the statements that she made in the Washington Post article that suggested that he had physically abused her during their relationship. Although Johnny and Amber both live in LA, the Washington Post is headquartered in Fairfax, Virginia. And because the claims arise out of statements made in that article, that's where it's properly filed. Okay, now I'm trying to make this as simple and straightforward as possible, but in order to explain the next part of this case, I kind of have to jump in time a little bit and explain another vignette. Now, you may have also heard about another lawsuit kind of sort of between these parties in the UK. Here's a brief explanation of that lawsuit so you can understand how that piece fits into this whole landscape. Remember that Johnny Depp and Amber Heard got divorced in 2016, and all of these allegations about the domestic violence restraining order and the pictures with the bruises and all that stuff came out around then. So in April 2018, The Sun published an article about the next Harry Potter universe movie, Fantastic Beasts: The Crimes of Grindelwald. In that article, the author referred to Johnny Depp as a wife beater. So in June 2018, Johnny Depp sued News Group Newspapers, the company that publishes The Sun. So although Amber Heard was not a party to the litigation in the UK, she was a very important witness. And that's because the basis of The Sun's use of the term wife beater was her allegations about him during their relationship. So in that lawsuit, after some delays, partially due to the COVID-19 pandemic, in July 2020, they went to trial. One thing that's interesting to note is that that trial was not in front of a jury, it was in front of a judge. Anyway, long story short, that lawsuit ended up unsuccessfully for Johnny Depp. He lost that trial. And whether or not the outcome of that lawsuit should properly impact the Virginia lawsuit is a subject that I can leave for another video. But suffice it to say that there are enough differences that the court determined that the one should not impact the outcome of the other. In other words, whatever happened in the trial against the publishers of The Sun doesn't really have any bearing on this lawsuit that Johnny Depp has directly against Amber Heard. Now, the way that it does relate to the Virginia case is the following. So after multiple attempts of trying to get this case filed by Johnny Depp against her thrown out, Amber Heard finally had to file what's called an answer, where she lists all of her defenses. In addition to that, in August 2020, she also filed counterclaims of her own. Now, there were all kinds of claims and all kinds of statements made that she had alleged were defamatory, but the vast majority of those ended up getting tossed out by the court, largely because of statute of limitations issues and other legal reasons. And basically what's been left through the whittling down by the court is a handful of statements by Johnny Depp's lawyer, Adam Waldman. Now, Waldman was making statements to the press in representation of Johnny Depp's position in his litigation, and based on the fact that he was calling Amber's allegations of physical abuse a hoax and other kinds of statements that he was making, Amber alleges that these are lies, these are defamatory, and not only that, but that they are attributable to Johnny Depp because we're talking about a lawyer who is an agent for a principal that is Johnny Depp. So now you have two parties that are suing one another for defamation for various statements that they have made related to whether or not Johnny Depp physically abused Amber Heard during their relationship, during their marriage. So because they are both alleging defamation, they both have a burden to prove certain elements. Let's get into what those elements are. for a claim of defamation. Now, normally for your average person claiming defamation, you have to show 5 basic elements. The first is that the defendant lied about the plaintiff. The second is that the defendant lied about the plaintiff to third parties, at least one other person that wasn't the plaintiff or the defendant. Third, the plaintiff has to show that the defendant lied negligently. Basically, they didn't take reasonable care or due caution before running their mouth about this person. Fourth, the plaintiff has to show that he or she suffered some kind of reputational harm. Usually there's a financial number that's related to that because it can impact somebody's income, somebody's job, that kind of thing. And finally, the plaintiff has to prove a causal link between the reputational harm and the lie that was said about them. Essentially to say that the reputational harm that they suffered was because of that lie that was told about them, and that it was foreseeable that that kind of a harm would result from that kind of a lie, and that it wasn't caused by something else that happened in their life. Now, in this case, there are 2 things that make it a little bit different than your average person's defamation case. The first thing is something called defamation per se. You see, there are certain types of lies that are so serious that courts will even just assume that they come with some very serious reputational harm. So a party that successfully shows that this is a case of defamation per se doesn't actually need to show or to prove all of those reputational harm damages, the financial numbers. There are a number of categories that a lie can fall into to qualify for defamation per se, but in Virginia, there's one in particular that's relevant to this case, and that is a lie that prejudices the plaintiff in his or her profession or trade. So in this case, the court found that both of the alleged statements, if they're shown to be true, are the kind that would seriously impact either Amber Heard's or Johnny Depp's profession or trade. And if you think about it, that makes a lot of sense. Either Johnny Depp gets canceled for being an abuser, or Amber Heard gets canceled for basically taking advantage of the MeToo movement and lying about somebody having abused her. So that's one way that this defamation case differs a little bit from an average person's defamation case. The other way that this case is different is admittedly a bit more important in terms of burdens of proof and whatnot, and it stems from who it is that is actually making the claim. Particularly, I'm talking about public figures. You see, when a public figure brings a defamation claim, they have a much higher standard to prove in order to win in a defamation case. And a lot of that is because of our very strong policy for the First Amendment. Our courts want people to be able to talk about incidents and people and events that are happening in the news. So when you have people that are in the news, you have people that are public figures, you have people whose voices are kind of automatically amplified just because of who they are, courts will say, we need a stronger ability to comment on these people. So they make it a lot harder for these people to prove defamation, but it kind of evens out if you think about it because of the fact that they have, like I said just a minute ago, essentially a natural megaphone that they have around them all the time, wherever they go, just kind of because of who they are. So they can go around on speaking tours. They can, talk on social media and people will listen. So, okay, in what way are defamation cases harder for people that are public figures than for your average person? Remember how I said that in a defamation case, the plaintiff has to prove that the defendant not only lied about the plaintiff, but lied with some level of negligence. Well, for a public figure defamation case, they have to show that they lied not with negligence, but with actual malice. Meaning they have to show that the defendant lied either knowing that what they were saying was false or that they acted with reckless disregard as to the truth or falsity of the statement that they were making. Now, in a lot of cases where you have someone lying about an incident that they weren't involved in, actual malice can be a massive burden, almost impossible in some cases to prove that that person actually knew that what they were talking about was wrong. Or that they knew that it was probably wrong and they just didn't care and they went ahead anyway without doing at least a minimal amount of research on it. But on the other hand, if a defendant in that kind of a case shows, no, I am basing my allegations that, the plaintiff did X, I'm basing it on a police report that was filed, that on its own is usually going to be enough. So that's an example of just how easy it can be to defend against a defamation claim where actual malice is one of the standards that they have to prove. But in a case like this, actual malice actually might not be that much more of a burden for these individuals because we are talking about incidents that are alleged to have occurred between them. So, admittedly, if a jury is going to be convinced that one side lied about whether or not abuse happened between them, it doesn't take much more of a logical leap for the jury to then conclude that the individual that was lying knew that they were lying because they knew that XYZ did not happen to them, or that XYZ they actually did. But even still, that is the standard for this case because we are talking about two different public figures making essentially the same kind of claims against one another. Okay, so that's the heart of this litigation. It really comes down to both sides needing to prove whether or not Johnny Depp physically abused Amber Heard, or whether or not, as Johnny Depp claims, Amber Heard was actually the one that was abusing him. So, why do people care about this case at all? These are two seemingly Hollywood elites that got caught up in a toxic mess that's really lasted longer than the marriage itself. That was the basis of this whole toxic lawsuit that has lasted years and years. Well, there are several reasons why people seem to be very passionate about this case. As you can tell by now, both sides are alleging some kind of domestic violence by the other. And so you have people that on both sides of this issue are very passionate about domestic violence issues and about the ability of victims to speak out, be heard, and seek justice. And particularly on the Johnny Depp side, you have a lot of people that also are concerned about the ability of men in domestic violence situations to be able to speak out, because realistically, this is something that does happen in the world. And there are a lot of domestic violence victims who happen to be male who don't speak up for a whole load of reasons, partly because either they're not believed or because there are certain stigmas or assumptions around masculinity and around the power dynamics between men and women. And then there are people who look at the MeToo movement and the degree to which the pendulum swung in a particular direction and think maybe that pendulum swung a little bit too far. And maybe that left too much room for individuals to come in and exploit that movement for their own personal gain and at the harm of other individuals. People that followed the Jussie Smollett trial were also concerned about something similar, where you had an individual who took the BLM movement and then subsequently was convicted of filing a false police report for an alleged hate crime that was committed against him in the middle of the night in downtown Chicago. After his conviction, the judge who sentenced him gave a very long, impassioned speech about the real victims of hate crimes and the fact that his case did so much damage to those legitimate victims, not only for the doubt that would come out of these kinds of cases, because people would ask, is this person a Jussie Smollett or is this legitimate? And so that can have an impact not only on whoever can be accused by these kinds of cases, but also by the legitimate victims who then think twice or a third time about coming forward because they don't want to get wrapped up in these kinds of quote unquote hoax cases. And when I say hoax cases, I mean alleged hoax cases. I'm not claiming anything on my own. I'm going off of what is being alleged here. Just making that clear. For me personally, as far as I see it, whatever your thoughts are about these various movements, whether you like them or not, whether you stand by their messaging or not, whether you think they're legitimate or not, we all should at the very least consider the possibility that when we are in times of conflict, crisis, or social movement that is sweeping through our culture, that there's always a possibility that someone is trying to use it for personal gain and at the expense of other individuals. So Was Johnny Depp wronged when he got canceled after Amber Heard came out with this Washington Post article? Or is Johnny Depp abusing the legal process by trying to silence a victim that he abused? We'll get into the more detailed allegations in another video. For my part, I remain open to all of the evidence, and I retain the right to change my opinion on a dime if evidence requires it. But I will say that at this point, there have been a few inconsistencies that have been coming up in Amber Heard's narrative. Those inconsistencies have been between her accounts and her friends' accounts, and even body cam footage by the LAPD coming in response to a 911 call. Now, in another video, I will go a bit more into the allegations within this lawsuit. If you want to know more, leave a comment below and be sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel. And subscribing to the channel is also a great idea because if you want to see this trial live streamed with legal commentary, be sure to subscribe, hit that notification bell, and stay tuned starting April 11th so you can see the trial right here. See you in the next video.